Hello and welcome to the NCEA Education Choice 2021 Opportunities and Challenges presentation. My name is Jennifer Daniels. I am Associate Director for Public Policy at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and I am joined by my colleague, Shawn.
I'm Shawn Peterson, President of Catholic Education Partners. Glad to be here today.
Great. Well, today what we're going to try to do is give you an update on school choice here from my perspective here in Washington and from Shawn's perspective working across the country in various states. And then also talk about how the COVID pandemic has impacted our schools and the conversation around parental choice across the country. So to get us started, let's go ahead and tell you a little bit more about our organizations. I am in the Committee for Catholic Education, or I report to the Committee on Catholic Education within the Secretariat of Catholic Education at the USCCB. And my focus is to ensure Catholic schools and their teachers and their students have access to federal education programs, such as the Every Student Succeeds Act, children with special needs through the IDEA program and E-rate, as well as hoping to increase access to school choice at the federal level.
And I had an organization called Catholic Education Partners. We were established in 2017, in part by an initiative from the USCCB. And it was felt that we were a needed voice in Catholic education choice on the state level. And we work with Catholic conferences, your local bishop, other Catholic organizations, the Catholic community. And we really do that to advance state level policy. We do this in all 50 states, and we're happy to be partners with USCCB and NCA and others so that we can allow more families and children to enjoy the benefits of a great Catholic education.
Great. So to start with, what does the Catholic Church say regarding parental choice in education? I want to just give you a couple quotes here, starting with the Catechism. Here, the Catechism gives the whole story. Parents have the right to choose a school for them which corresponds to their own personal convictions. This right is fundamental, and public authorities have the duty of guaranteeing this parental right and ensuring concrete conditions for its exercise. So we're all very familiar with the concept of parents are their child's first teachers, but even the Catechism goes further to say, speak to the role of public authorities in being able to access this right. And then moving on to all the way back to Vatican II, they use the phrase in Gravissima Educationis. Pope Paul VI uses the phrase distributive justice. And so again, it's not enough that parents have a choice, but they need resources to be able to act on this choice. And so they say that public subsidies should be paid out in a way that parents are truly free. And then finally, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops in a 2005 document on Catholic education goes even further, that parents are their primary educators of their children, and the entire Catholic community should be encouraged to advocate for parental school choice. So if you're a parent or not a parent, you should be engaged in this conversation on behalf of our children. So as we know or discuss the church teaching, that certainly informs our advocacy and our work on legislation. And so Shawn's going to talk about how we use the church teachings as we draft legislation across the country.
Yeah, and I would just say too that in addition to how it informs, we're just very blessed as a church that we have so much teaching on education choice, on religious education, on Catholic schools, and the rights of parents as first educators. We have so many beautiful documents that lay this out and really inform what our teachings are. And we don't have to go back and make up new things. We don't have to look to a lot of secular resources. We just have all these beautiful documents, many church documents, as the ones Jennifer just mentioned. We have some that are older than that. And so we're just really blessed to have those and to inform our work. And so when we look at education choice in a state, looking at a state policy or drafting legislation, we have some important things that we have to look at. First and foremost, we have to make sure that there is no infringement on the mission of the Catholic school in any state. So that's first and foremost when we look at legislation. We have to make sure that that includes religious liberty issues, that there's nothing in legislation that speaks to our curriculum and what we may and may not teach. Testing issues, we've had some of those issues crop up in education choice legislation. And then employment, which has been in the last few years, there have been some major stories on employment issues dealing with Catholic schools. So we always make sure at CEP, when we're working with your Catholic conference or others, that we make sure that there's no infringement in any way on the operation of our schools. Then, of course, as always, we have to have a preferential option for the poor. This legislation, these pieces of legislation are why we're doing this. We're trying to give families and children an option that they might not have because of economics. So preferential option for the poor, always uppermost in our mind when we look at these things. And then we also want to make sure that funds are directed toward the parents. As Jennifer said, they are the first teachers of our children. They have rights and responsibilities with that. And so we want to make sure that funds are directed towards them so that they can make the best decisions and not necessarily funds directed at a school. This way also we can make sure that there are no entanglements in the bill, that government does not have, going back to bullet point 1, that the government cannot tell our schools what to teach or how to teach it, because those monies are not going directly to schools.
Great, thank you. And so now we wanted to move on to what types of programs are we advocating for? We have these parameters that are important no matter what type of program, but what do the programs actually look like? And so we wanted to highlight 4 different types of programs that you may see in your states already, or you may be a part of advocating for in your states right now. The first one is scholarship tax credits, and these are the most prevalent across the country, where you have a state tax credit given for the donation of funds to a scholarship organization who would then provide the scholarship to the parents, and the parents can take the scholarship to the school of their choice. And they're able to fundraise through private donors or a corporation, depending on the state. And those donations are given this tax credit in order to encourage donations. These are great because the money is fundraised from a private source as opposed to having to rely on a direct appropriation, which leads us to the next type, which is a school voucher. Vouchers are different in that they rely on some taxpayer funding. Usually it could be at the state level, or here in Washington, we actually have a federal voucher. So that money has to be advocated for every year. It might go up, it might go down based on the status of the economy or the state government. But again, it's similar is that the parents would apply for those vouchers, and then the parents can take the voucher to the school of their choice. Next is education savings accounts, which are similar to the voucher in that they're usually funded through taxpayer dollars, but they have a lot more flexibility to them. So when we see an education savings account, it has a lot more control for the parents to use the funding for what variety of education services beyond just private school tuition. And then finally, individual tuition tax credits, which would be made available to parents to recoup some of the funding that they have spent out of pocket on behalf of their children. Now, in some states, you might see 2 of these in different formats. And it's always kind of evolving the way they're playing out across the country. And as Shawn will talk to you a little bit in a little bit, we're seeing education savings accounts becoming one of the more popular options in legislatures right now. So I'm going to focus now on the federal level, and then we'll transition to Shawn talking about what's going on at the state level. So first of all, I just wanted to put a little context into what's going on at the federal level based on what happened over the past couple years, and some victories that we've had and some improvements to the national conversation. So first of all, we do have one federal school choice program, that is the DC Opportunity Scholarship. A relatively small program, serves almost 2,000 children here in Washington, D.C., but it is the only federal school choice program, and so it is a major priority of the bishops. We work very closely with the Archdiocese of Washington, as over half of the children attend Catholic schools here in Washington, and we were able to successfully get that program reauthorized in 2019, and it was a really important priority. As it is now a 15-year-old program, and we want that program to stay strong every year. Beyond that, there was just a much broader conversation about school choice in Washington, with the Trump administration prioritizing school choice and appointing Secretary Betsy DeVos as the head of the Department of Education, who came from, over several decades of advocating for parental choice back in Michigan, where she is from, and they put together a bill called Education Freedom Scholarships. And this is a scholarship tax credit program, but it would create an opportunity for scholarship organizations in all 50 states. And rather than a state tax credit, it would be a federal tax credit for those donations. And while the program did not ultimately pass by the end of Congress, there were over 100 sponsors to the legislation between both the House and the Senate. There was a lot of conversation across the country. It raised the profile of the idea. There was a lot of grassroots activity around this, and a lot of congressmen going on the record here in Washington that they support such a program. We were working really closely and thought we had a great shot of getting this passed. Unfortunately, until the COVID pandemic came along and really halted our efforts as we shifted our focus on response to the COVID pandemic. But throughout those conversations, the idea was to try to involve a version of education freedom scholarships in the pandemic funding relief bills, and it evolved into what was called the School Choice Now Act. It basically would have operated just like the Education Freedom Scholarships, but with a plus up of some funding to fund the scholarship granting organizations with the relief funding. That didn't ultimately make it into the final COVID package, but it did get inserted in the bill. It was voted on in the Senate, and it was passed in the Senate. So we have a majority of senators supporting such a program. And it did evolve into what we're implementing right now, which is the Emergency Non-Public Schools program, which gave us a dedicated set aside to get relief to private schools specifically. And this was all kind of the result of the work and the conversations about school choice and parental choice in the COVID negotiations. So that being said, we had an election. November, Washington changed drastically. We have a whole new House and Senate and a new president, and things are definitely different politically going forward for the next 2 years. But that said, there is a lot of energy here in Washington still, and we have had 7 or 8 school choice programs introduced already in the 117th Congress. One of those was the Education Freedom Scholarships, same bill, same idea. And we'll be working to try and educate, especially new congressmen, about this program, let them know the wide amount of support it had in the last Congress, and hope that we can get that support up again. We also are very supportive of a 529 expansion bill that is a follow-on on the 2017 tax cuts bill, where they allowed parents who save funds in an education savings account to not only use the money for higher ed, but to now be able to use that money for K-12 private school tuition. This expansion bill allows parents to do even more with their savings. beyond private school tuition, such as books and materials, tutoring, and other things outside of private school tuition. So we'll continue to support that legislation. And then again, DCOSP, we are pushing for a permanent reauthorization of this program so that it politically is more stable for the families that participate, and allow for just an expansion of the schools that are able to participate, and to allow the program to grow. So those are going to be some of our priorities in the next 2 years, as well as our continuing work to respond to the corona pandemic going forward. So Shawn, let's turn it over to you to give us an idea of what's going on across the country at the state level.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. So just to give you a little bit about what's going on, like what is current and what the state level landscape looks like historically. There are currently 29 states, including, as Jennifer said, the District of Columbia, and also Puerto Rico, that have some form of private education choice. I'm not including homeschooling, I'm not including charter schools, or virtual, online learning types of situations, but actually just like private education, what we might think of as traditional Catholic schools and other schools. So 29 states that have that. Now, in these 29 states and DC and Puerto Rico, there are 67 separate private education choice programs. As Jennifer mentioned, some states have more than one. Some states might have an opportunity scholarship that they started at first, and now they're moving into an ESA. They've gotten an ESA. Some states have 2 or 3, possibly all 4 programs, depending on when they started and how they were successful. They expanded some programs, they added others. So again, 67 separate private education programs across the United States. Now, 3 of these state programs, interestingly enough, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, which all have actually quite old programs, but they do currently not allow religious school choice. So they might have private education choice, but you couldn't, for example, pick a Catholic school in these programs. Thankfully, all 3 are being challenged right now at the US Supreme Court, and that those challenges are based on the 2020 Espinosa versus Montana decision, which I'll talk about in a minute. Want to talk a little bit about the Blaine Amendments. So Blaine Amendments were essentially anti-Catholic clauses that were inserted into state constitutions. And they were really to prohibit Catholic schools from getting any kind of taxpayer funding as a religious entity. Now, today, it's not just Catholic schools that are not able to receive this funding. It's also Protestant schools, Jewish schools, Muslim schools, any kind of religious school. But really, it's interesting that they were born out of sort of this 19th century animus against Catholic schools, and thankfully those are being seen for what they are, and they really are anti-Catholic, anti-religious, and but right now I believe there's I think it's 37 states that have Blaine Amendments. And they vary. In Michigan has a very strict Blaine Amendment, and then you've got states that are much less, I would say, much less strict, and they can work around these things. This is just a map that everyone can kind of see, depending on what state you're in, if it's a narrow interpretation, broad interpretation, or kind of a mixed interpretation of how the Blaine Amendment is applied when looking at these pieces of legislation. Florida, for example, has a Blaine Amendment, but it's a very, it's a broad interpretation of really what that means. And so, but Florida has a lot of school choice. So that's sort of interesting that's the way that is. So, so the Blaine Amendments really ties us now in with the Espinosa decision, which was a great decision at the U.S. Supreme Court, long time coming. It dealt with a family in Montana. Montana had a private school choice program that they enacted, but the lower courts in their state court ruled that you did not have to allow someone to attend a private religious school, even though you had private school tuition being able to be paid. And so the U.S. Supreme Court sent down a decision that said basically that violates the free exercise clause of the Constitution. That if you're going to have these state programs, you cannot exclude religious schools. So this was a landmark case, and this will be used to challenge Blaine provisions in all the other states. Going back to those 3 states I was talking about, this is the Espinosa decision will be really used to strike down those three decisions, and we're hoping to have a good decision in all of those. A couple of caveats here. Now, the Espinosa decision does not eliminate Blaine Amendments out of state constitutions. That really has to be done at the state level by state legislatures or votes that they put on the ballot. It also does not mean that public dollars have to be used for private education. It doesn't force a state to pass school choice. It simply means that if you have a private school choice program, you cannot exclude faith-based schools from participating. So that's a really good decision for us, and I think it'll lead to a lot of other good decisions as we go along. Now, we've looked at a little bit like what states currently have school choice, education choice programs in their state law. Wanted to talk a little bit about opportunities. There's some great opportunities for 2021 for education choice. Currently, 28 states have introduced legislation to create new or expanded existing choice programs, which is fantastic. A lot of these are, as Jennifer mentioned, a lot of states are going to the ESA model because it gives the most freedom to a family to really choose what type of education is best for their child. But there are still some tax credit scholarships being legislated, and then also some individual tax credits in certain states for families. So as of this recording, as of 3/2/21, 12 of these bills have passed at least one legislative body or committee, which is great. That's a big percentage. We don't usually get that many school choice bills moving in a positive direction in 1 year. So that's fantastic. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but I think this is in part due to what we've seen as a result of COVID and some of the reactions that are going on. I will say that while these are all positive things and we keep pushing for positive legislation, and while no state legislature has ever eliminated an education choice program, we've always got to be on the front lines of advocacy. Our parents, our schools, our bishops and our Catholic conferences, we've always got to advocate for not only the expansion and addition of these programs, but for protection of existing ones. Just as an example, and Jennifer knows this well, the Boost program in Maryland is under threat right now. The legislature there, as a result of elections, was not good for the school choice on the school choice side of the ledger. And so we're really watching that program and what's going on in Maryland. That would be the first program ever eliminated if they do get rid of it. We're still hoping, and we're working there with the Maryland Catholic Conference and others to make sure that that does not happen.
So that leads us to say, okay, if we're having this growing support in the legislative bodies across the country, how much public support do these programs have? And the American Federation for Children releases a new survey or poll every year telling us a little bit about public support of school choice. And this is the result of their January 2021 survey. And as you can see, we have overwhelming public support for parental choice across the country. And this transcends race. African Americans support at 74%, Latinos over 70%, and political party with 69% of independents supporting and even 55% of Democrats supporting, which is a bit of a disconnect from the support we see from public officials. So it is a good winning issue for all of our legislators to take a look at. And as we, as advocates, continue to make our voices heard, it is very helpful for this wide support to be shared as we go to our legislators and say, look, this is what the families want, and this is what the families are asking for. And while this has tended to be more on the right of the issues, that's kind of the narrative that you put out there, the reality is much, much different from that. And so it's really up to us to share that story with our legislators as we talk about why these programs are important. So that being said, Shawn's going to tell us a little bit about how COVID has impacted our Catholic schools and how school choice can be brought into this conversation as we look at the impact of COVID on our Catholic schools.
So COVID, obviously, you all know this that are watching this, this video. You all know that COVID did have a terrible effect on our Catholic schools and our Catholic students and students around the country. Just some, NCAA is great with having with data, and so just kind of an overview. So there's roughly 1.6 million students attending Catholic schools today. But that was a decline. There's been a decline of 111,000 students from the 1920 to the 2021 school year, and that's a 6.4% drop, which is the largest drop in the last 50 years. That even counts things like recessions and big downturns in the economy, which hurt our schools. But that even includes the abuse crisis and the terrible time the church went through with that, and the effect that had on our schools. So that's a huge drop for our Catholic school populations. Over 200 Catholic schools closed or consolidated. We know that where those schools were, obviously, and we know that those closures disproportionately impacted underserved families, as they often do. And again, those families that are in those communities don't often have options to say, well, my Catholic school is closing in my neighborhood, so I'll drive across town, or I'll go to the next, the next better Catholic school. Might be more expensive. We don't know. So, again, back to that preferential option for the poor, those closures always impact underserved families first. Thankfully, as well, thanks to work at the USCCB, we probably have a lot more closures if not for federal assistance programs like the Paycheck Protection Program. So we're thankful that the USCCB fought for that and got legislators to include Catholic schools in that. So just kind of by the numbers to give you some idea on financials, if you take 111,000 students, mostly which were elementary school age, you multiply that by the average cost of tuition for a Catholic grade school, that's $4,800. It comes to $500 million, $532 million in lost operating funds. That's a huge, huge amount that we've lost in Catholic education. And those are the dollars, and I know those are not the important thing. The important thing is, that people have lost their schools. They might not be going to a Catholic school now. So that's the real loss. But there is a dollar loss that we have to think about and what that means. And again, I believe, and lots of people have speculated in this, those losses would have been far, far greater if Catholic schools would not have reopened. They reopened, they did so safely. They got kids back in front of teachers in the classroom, which a majority of our public schools did not do. And I think that caused that's caused repercussions for public schools. It's been, a little bit of a boon for Catholic schools in some places with parents doing what we call sector switching. They've taken kids out of the public school because they wanted them in front of teachers with kids in a classroom. So that has been good. We've learned lessons from that. But COVID has also helped to highlight the weakness of the traditional funding model for Catholic education. And that is the traditional funding model, obviously, as we know, it's tuition from parents and donations from parishioners and high level donors that support our Catholic schools. But this is just not sustainable over the long run. And it just takes another crisis, another pandemic, or something else to really take another 200 schools under. So that's why we really want to now focus on school choice and education choice, because we have to look at different ways to fund parents, to fund families, and to sustain great Catholic schools, so that those children have those options and those choices. So just a little bit about too, I threw this in, I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but it is very interesting. We have seen an uptick. Jennifer showed you those numbers a little bit ago about public choice support, school choice support. Part of that has been because schools have been closed. And part of the reason schools have been closed in large part in many places is because teacher unions have demanded that they be closed. So these are just some interesting headlines from some newspapers, and these are by no means conservative newspapers. I mean, the New York Times, Bloomberg, the Boston Herald, Tribune, these are not super conservative newspapers, but this is what they're saying. I mean, these are actual headlines that I pulled, and I could have pulled 50 other headlines that said the same thing. So public opinion is changing it's getting even better than it was. And as Jennifer highlighted, public opinion is well over 50% for education choice. And it's just getting, I think it's going to get higher and higher the longer that public schools remain closed, and the longer that Catholic schools continue to do this fantastic job that they've been doing through COVID. So just going back, this is from a few years ago now. Fatica and NCA did this great market research study, and data and knowledge is power, and that helps us in what we do. But 81% of Catholic parents and 62% of non-Catholic parents had said they're very willing to send their children to Catholic schools if they qualified for a choice program. That's so important because, again, it comes down to economics sometimes for families. Especially during COVID, we had a lot of job loss, business closures, things like that. If you have to choose between the rent and groceries and car insurance and tuition, tuition's going to be the first thing that generally goes. You've got to have those other things; those are necessities, and people just don't look at tuition as a necessity. So they have to make those hard choices. But imagine if we had school choice programs in every state. Imagine what we could do to fill the seats in our Catholic schools and to get those kids and that Catholic school option. Now, what's interesting on the flip side is you see these high numbers of parents that would say they would send their kid to a Catholic school if they had a choice program. But in reality, even in those states that have it, only 34% of all these parents know that they live in a school choice state. So we've maybe done a good job on the one end of getting these programs passed and into law and activated. What we don't seem to be doing a good job of is telling parents that you live in a school choice, you have those options. So those two bullet points intersect at some point, and we've got to make sure that we're doing our job as organizations, as principals and superintendents and teachers, of letting parents know, hey, did you know we have an ESA program, we have a scholarship program, we have a tax credit in our state that you could use to attend a great Catholic school. So just, again, I love data, I love numbers, because it really influences where we might go with these things. So a 2019 survey of 28 state programs in 20 different states. And we were grateful to Catholic conferences and diocesan staff and even state government and scholarship organizations that helped us with this data. But we know that $538 million is the amount that Catholic schools receive from choice programs. That's an incredible number. And if you'll remember the number that I showed you earlier about the loss of dollars, this is almost dollar for dollar the amount that we currently receive. So imagine if we had education choice programs in 50 states and the participation level. Imagine what that would mean for our Catholic families, for our Catholic school programs, and what we could do with that. 65,000 kids using vouchers to attend Catholic schools. 72,000 scholarships kids attending Catholic schools. It's just, these numbers are incredible, but they're not where they should be, and they're not where we want them to be. So we've got to keep fighting for these school choice programs, enacting more policies, expanding school choice, both on the federal level, as Jennifer was talking about, and at your state level. And we can just make these numbers go up and up so that every child, I always say that upper middle class families and wealthy families have always had school choice in our country. They've had it in every state for decades and decades because they have the monetary ability to make that choice. But poor families, struggling middle class families do not have school choice, and that is that is not for the common good. The common good is when all people have those choices.
Well, very well said. The statistics, give us that support that we need to know that we should keep working harder on this issue across the country. And I wanted to ask you about one kind of change that we've been seeing in the past, literally just a couple months, about the conversations at the state level and how they're actually talking about school choice, and a new phrase, if you will, where legislators are talking about funding students as opposed to funding systems. And how that has evolved out of the COVID pandemic and just the broad engagement of parents directly in their child's education in the past year.
Yeah, that's an interesting phenomenon, Jennifer, that's going on right now, and you do hear that a lot. And I think as more people repeat it, then more people start picking up that catchphrase. But really, it basically what it comes down to is, again, focusing on the individual need of the student and their family and the parents, and not, saying, well, we've got these big behemoth, public schools and school systems, and we've got to keep sending money to them. It's like, no, we need to send money where, if we really believe in subsidiarity and these things that we talk about, we need to get money to families so that families can make the best choices. Now, they may choose that large public school district because there's lots of maybe bells and whistles there that they want, and that's fine. We believe that parents should be able to make that choice. But parents might also want to homeschool their child and need help doing that. Parents might want to send their kid to a Catholic school, and they should have that option. So really, I love that legislators in all these states are talking about funding children and not systems. Because when you think about it, with our other public programs, if we have a food assistance program, we're concerned about the person getting good meals and good nutrition. We're not concerned about keeping a grocery store in business. We're not concerned about, we don't tell someone who's on public assistance, well, you can only shop at this grocery store or that grocery store. We leave it up to that person to feed their family in the way that they think is best. If public housing, we try to give people options of where they can go live, where it's best for their family, closest to their job. We don't expect, well, this is your neighborhood building, so you've got to live there. It's just like, that's your neighborhood school. Great. If you want to go there, go there. But we should empower families and empower children for their education. We've been doing this on the federal level with Pell Grants and college for years. It's like, we make all these options open for families, and then families choose which university or college is best for their child. We don't, we're not like the old Soviet bloc countries where we say, well, we're going to pick your profession and we're going to pick where you go to school and we're going to pick, we don't do that. And so K-12 is so important. Why would we do that in that system?
Well said. Well, we want to leave you today with our contact information. We would love to continue this conversation with you, and we wanted to make sure you could reach us directly. We'd be happy to share the PowerPoint with you if you would like some of this information at your fingertips. We both have websites that you can learn more about our work. If you go to USCCB's website in our office, we have a newsletter. You can sign up there and get the latest from Washington on the public policy relating to Catholic schools. And we certainly hope that you'll continue to follow what's going on in your states. We've got to spread the word, inform our schools, our parents, our priests, our bishops, and keep everyone up to date on the latest from the school choice front. And we will do our best to get you that information as thoroughly as possible. Shawn, do you have any closing words for us?
No, I just want to thank everyone that's watching this, and I would encourage people in their states to contact their state Catholic conference if you have one, or reach out to your, the bishop's office to find out about what legislation might be going on in your state, what might be happening right now, and what options you have for parents so that you can better inform parents for your schools. And we've also got, as Jennifer mentioned, we've got a brand new website. Actually, it's hopefully will be launched by the time people are watching this, so we should have some good resources for you there as well. And I just want to thank Jennifer for co-hosting this with me today, and I hope everyone found it informational and helpful.
All right, we'll end there, and we hope you continue to enjoy NCA this week and have a great week. Thank you.